catch more flies with honey than vinegar. China used better trade tactics to attract more trade partners by trying to use sweet and appealing trade tactics. What I mean by that is that Confucian China was more civilized than Christian Europe politically, religiously, and economically. China wanted to enhance the Ming Dynasty's image worldwide because they wanted to make money. So basically, they were financially driven. However, although Europe was also financially driven, they were equally motivated to proselytize their faith. China's religious tolerance decreased the amount of conflict with other nations. China, consisting of Muslims, Buddhists, and the Confucian perspectives, helped to create better relations with other nations. Take Zheng He, for example. He was chosen by the emperor to be the leader of the voyages because of his Islamic heritage, which helped to create better relations with other Islamic countries. Religious tolerance has proven, still to this day, to be significant for growth of trade. To this day, places with religious tolerance includes the US, China, Thailand, Sweden, and even Singapore. People with any type of religion living in these countries are accepted because they have religious tolerance. Proselytization was not one of China's motives during trade. However, it was for the Christians. Their intentions were not only to trade, but to bring their way of life to other countries, believing that their way of life would pull them out of poverty. But in reality, they were perceived as colonists, wanting to conquer other lands and put those lands under the name of their king. Take Magellan, for example. Under the papal bulls, he landed on Cebu to spread Christianity, but was later killed in the Battle of Mactan by native warriors. Places with religious extremism had more conflict. To this day, places such as Burma, Israel, and Iraq have religious extremism. In Burma, there are Muslims against Buddhists. In Israel, there are Muslims against Jews. And in Iraq, there are Muslims against Christians. So China's way of religious tolerance has proven to be a significant factor leading to growth in trade. China's political and religious strategy resulted in greater economic results in trade than the European nations. China's result in trade had a trickle-down effect, which means that not only did the emperor amass large sums of money, but also the supply chain which produced the exported goods became wealthy as well. Because the products that the Ming Dynasty produced became so famous throughout the world, today their products can still be found throughout the world. Thank you. Do you guys have like paper? Because I have to write down the...
You normally keep paper behind you.
Oh, yeah, I can put the stuff up there. That's really important.
Okay. Do you need a pencil?
Yeah, I'll... yeah. Okay.
Oscar, do you have anything to say?
No, you can start right now.
No, I mean...
Just start from one side and go to the other side.
Yeah,
It's
so
like before.
Okay. I thought it was good.
No, tell me my
Okay, if you guys have
improvements.
something to say, then say it. If you don't, then
Yeah, exactly.
Just improvements,
So,
guys.
do you have anything?
It was slightly monotone at times.
I'm sorry?
It was slightly memorized and monotone at times.
Okay.
It seemed like
Wait, is that something I need to work on, or is
yeah,
that...
I need to work on
Okay,
it.
okay. Okay.
Crystal? Nothing? Yes?
Yeah, kind of like So had said, it kind of felt like you were just kind of like reciting it sometimes.
I noticed that you tried to use a few SAT words like, I can't even pronounce it. Proselytization.
I didn't know that was really... Because I didn't know what other word to say.
What
Because
does that
means...
mean?
It pretty much means, like, to wanting to spread. So, like, I said that Europe wanted to proselytize their faith. So they wanted to share their faith.
Just say spread their prosperity.
Okay.
I don't know. And then you talked about papal bulls, but you didn't
Yeah, I don't know.
you didn't like tell us what they were. So if we didn't know what they were, we would be lost.
Okay.
And then you used a lot of like modern day references, but you didn't have as much fact to support your claim
I didn't feel like you had a lot of evidence with the Europeans. You talked about like China and their tolerance with religion, but like I didn't like hear any hard facts about the Europeans.
Like what, like examples or something? Because I had like a few examples in it for. No, I'm just asking like what is it that what more do you want to hear about the Europeans? Like,
Well,
what
because
do
when you
think
started
we
to
should hear
talk about the Europeans, you started to go more towards modern day. Like you talked about like Israel, and you talked about Burma, was it? Yeah.
Those are the places with religious extremism today.
Yeah. But like I guess like were you saying like more like evidence based things versus like modern day experience?
Okay.
I think like connecting to modern day is really good for a conclusion, but for a body paragraph, since you're comparing Europeans and China.
You did good, man. Congrats.
Thanks.
I don't know. It should say good job, but it said congrats.
What was the time, guys?
It was 3:07.
3:07.
I wrote it down.
Okay. Alright, Cece's coming in next, so.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Your voice was quivering.
I don't think she was Jesus.
Okay, guys, let's wait for the next person.
I didn't
What was
hear
her
Jesus
thesis?
or a
Yeah.
That they're talking about.
Yes, I didn't hear Jesus.
Yeah.
She talked about religious tolerance in modern day.
I didn't hear anything
That's
about
what was my
Europeans. Yeah, I
That's
didn't
what I
hear.
was trying to say.
Relax with this.
Is it recording?
Yes, it's recording. Someone will trust them.
Start when you're ready, Cece.
Nice place.
Normally, the second ones are expected to better than the first in a family. Then what was the reason behind the Europeans' failure to outstand the civilized Chinese? During the 1400s to 1500s, Zheng He and Da Gama set off on maritime expeditions from the west and the east across the Indian Ocean to find trade routes. The Chinese were far more civilized than the Europeans were due to their different motives and ways of interaction. Initially, the two civilizations set off to find trade routes, around the Indian Ocean. However, the different goals the Europeans and Chinese had economically and religiously set brought out different outcomes of these. So sorry. Can I start over?
Yeah.
Can you not smile at me next time? Oh wait.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. Take a deep breath.
This never happened.
Come on, David. You're smart. You.
I was not smiling.
Okay.
It was
Okay.
funny. It was
Okay.
her.
Okay.
Normally, the second ones are expected to do better than the first in a family. Then what was the reason behind the Europeans' failure to outstand the civilized Chinese? During the 1400s to 1500s, Zheng He and Da Gama set off on maritime expeditions to find trade routes across the Indian Ocean from the west and the east. The Chinese were far more civilized than the Europeans were due to their different motives and ways of interaction. Initially, the two civilizations set off to find trade routes around the Indian Ocean. However, the different goals the Europeans and Chinese had economically set brought out different outcomes of these explorations. Da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, was sent by King John III to find a maritime trade route that would connect Europe and the East through the Indian Ocean to bring back riches like gold. Another motive of their European explorations was to spread Christianity through the foreign lands they reached. Nonetheless, the Europeans wanted more than just an introduction of their religion to the people. They wanted a mass conversion and penetrated other religions that came in their way. During the time of expeditions, Europe's main power was also controlled by high religious figures, also known as popes, which explains the force on religion. On the other side of the globe, Zheng He, a eunuch from Yunnan, was sent by Emperor Yongle during the Ming Dynasty. Yongle wanted Zheng He to establish healthy relationships and earn the respect that honored the Ming Dynasty. In the bigger picture, Yongle wanted China to be the center of trade networks and economy, and to also create allies with foreign countries. To be fair, China had certain materialistic cravings, like the Europeans did, but it was not for the same intentions. In addition, China accepted different religions into their culture by even building religious buildings for Muslims and Christians to pray in. Both motives were forms of self-benefit, but the Chinese motives were beneficial to the whole community for many future generations to come. Another aspect that makes China's explorations much more significant is the way the Chinese and the Europeans interacted with foreigners. In the Indian Ocean, the Europeans were also often called pirates, as they were barbaric when greeting foreigners. For example, they captured innocent Arab and Muslim vessels that passed by, disrupted cities, and slaughtered people in the most terrifying ways. On the other hand, the Chinese were incomparably friendly to foreigners, and always impressed kings with bountiful gifts and official stone tablets that promised more goods. Not only did the Chinese impress others with goods, but also promised certain countries to provide security and lent some of their men. By doing so, the Chinese had great relations with foreign countries, which helped achieve their main goal. Although the Chinese occasionally used violence to force pirates to be executed, it was only to intimidate people who thought to come in their way. In the end, the Chinese were far more sophisticated and intelligent in terms of how they interacted with foreigners that brought them closer towards their main motive. The Chinese are proven to be far more impressive during the age of explorations due to their knowledgeable tactics to interact with other countries in order to achieve their goal. Maybe it is actually the first ones that always leave a better impression that the second ones can never outstand along the family of maritime expeditions. Thank you.
Oscar.
When you're in your hook, you use like ones. I think you should use childs instead because ones is a bit too big. I feel.
One's is like too big.
No, it's too big. Vague.
They okay.
Like you should use child or.
All right.
Wow. That's good.
It was good, just the nerves. But that's like, yeah, everyone has the nerves. I noticed that you were holding up your paper. Maybe like put it down on the podium because it makes it look less like you're reading it and it makes us pay more attention to you. And
In your speech when you were talking about Zheng He, you said that he was a eunuch from somewhere, but you didn't define what that was, so outsiders would not know what that is. So I just defined that. Aside from that, it was good.
Yeah, I really liked your hook. Maybe you could like put that into your conclusion somehow.
She did.
That was her
I
last.
can't listen. Okay, and also your eye contact was really good, but like I noticed you were like looking over there on that side, and no one's really
And
sitting
occasionally
there.
you were
but,
staring at the whiteboard.
So I was like really confused.
Like,
It's
you know how we were supposed to do the spider thing, but no one's sitting there?
Yeah.
So am I just
So like
supposed to
the
look
back
at
for
you?
your audience,
Yeah.
you know, because we're all.
Oh, but I thought it would look like too much that I'll like, be in the middle. Okay.
It's fine. Who's after you?
I
Also, wait,
don't know.
Do you want?
I'm gonna tell Chris to. God, I can hear him from here.
Yeah, they're playing games.
At the beginning, like when you did your like first try thing,
Okay.
when like I don't know if it's not you, if it was me, sorry, but like it kind of made you laugh. Like it's fine, it's not that big a deal, but like maybe try to like keep it cool.
Yeah. I wasn't really,
Yeah, yeah.
in that. Okay, sorry.
But it was good.
Okay, thank you.
next person, whoever that is, to come in. Let's go in, please. Thank you.
Mr. Brown was always the one to comment on content because I feel like he's gonna watch the video and then he's gonna like someone's gonna correct
They
someone
don't know if it's after CC.
and then he's gonna watch the video and be like that was wrong, like you corrected them wrong.
He's gonna be like, yeah, you're correct.
And we're gonna feel really bad. And then it's gonna be super awkward. I don't know. I
didn't think so.
Guys, just 1 second. I'll go get somebody, okay?
I don't use that word. I just felt it.
Wait, Jim, can you like
You can move your wire from your shoulder. Or you can wear it if you want.
The age of exploration is what can be seen by many people as one of the most important periods in our history. And it has demonstrated many things about our civilization today and how it happened. But two civilizations that have partaken in this great venture have demonstrated themselves in very different ways, and I argue that the Chinese have shown themselves to be much more civilized than the Europeans in many ways. First of all, the Chinese expedition harbored extremely large ships, which were about 390 feet long at the biggest, and their engineering complexity and the complexity of their engineering and the huge feats that they managed to accomplish during the duration of the Ming Dynasty that clearly shows that the Chinese were at the very least much more proficient in this region, and also shows with correlation. However, in contrast, the European ships were much smaller in comparison and had much less cargo capacity, and as a result, the explorers often had to suffer scurvy and many other related diseases that were caused by this hardship. Second of all, and the Chinese policy system was based on the Chinese policy system was based off a system of tributaries, which included many formal diplomatic relationships between many states, and it rarely devolved into any sort of conflict that usually resulted in war or any of those things that were so much more common in the European stage. In contrast, the European policies were based on gunboat diplomacy, which involved extortion, and they often started conflict with each other, exhibiting severe fanaticism, widespread abuse of power, and as an example, during the Children's Crusades, an example of the horrible acts of the Europeans during that age, several children were widespread movement by children to start a crusade in the Middle East resulted in a huge mass influx in the slave market. Finally, Zheng He, the most prominent explorer who led the naval expeditions of China beginning in 1405, demonstrated good diplomacy, giving out plenty of gifts, respect, and in general being a rather benign explorer. In comparison, the European gunboat diplomacy and the leader of the naval expedition that led to the discovery of the Indies by Portugal. He demanded much of the Indies, and he was a kidnapper, a pirate, a thief, and a liar at the same time, and exhibited in many circumstances cultural insensitivity and unsophistication, such as the case when they ordered every single Muslim out of the city of one city that they encountered during their on their encounters. In conclusion, the Chinese During the Age of Exploration, the Chinese exhibited much higher levels of sophistication, peacefulness, and benign relations with the kingdoms they encountered on their travels, in contrast to the Europeans, who systematically slaughtered anyone who came across and who came in their way. Thank you. Feedback. How horrible was it?
There's some paper right there.
Yep. Where's my pencil?
It's on the wall.
Okay. Moving on.
Anyone?
Yes.
I think your content was good because you have a lot of prior knowledge and a lot of knowledge of history, but your delivery, I'm pretty sure was
Yeah.
a bit shaky, and especially with your constant clearing of your throat and when you made a mistake, you kind of said excuse me or sorry or something like that. It kind of brought attention to that mistake. You should just not say anything and you try to talk on.
No, but you're supposed to say excuse me. So.
You
No,
just say
it's
excuse me.
But if it wasn't noticeable,
If it wasn't noticeable
Yeah,
for
like-
us, I mean, just
Yeah.
So hits.
I thought your intro on bodies were good, but your conclusion was kind of restating your thesis. So you need to improve that. And you kind of mumbled a few words occasionally, especially at the ends of your sentences. You kind of swallowed words. So you need to improve that.
It was a good speech. Your content was really good, but at your conclusion, you have a lot of ands.
Yeah.
You say and a lot, so just that, and then you kick your jacket at one point. That was a bit distracting with us. Yeah.
I thought your thesis could have been stronger since, I think it was your thesis, but I think what was a part of your thesis said, I argue, and
Yeah.
I think it would make it more formal, formal speaking, Mr. Bell taught us to take out the I argue and just state it and then argue it later. The arguing should be implied. And also in your thesis you said something about the Chinese being more civilized than the Europeans, or in many ways.
Looks a little bit late.
I think what might make it
Never mind.
I think what might make it stronger would be maybe listing the many ways that you're going to talk about, so then the audience is captivated and know what you're going to talk about. Also, at one point, I think you were referring to Zheng He. You said Zheng He.
Yeah, but I can't. I just was sorry.
Yeah, I was just kind of
mispronunciation.
I assumed it was Zheng He. I was just a bit confused as to what it meant.
Okay, it's spelled Zheng He, and its actual Chinese pronunciation is Zheng, but in English it's actually I guess that could be okay. Never mind.
But yeah, Mr. Brown says Zheng He, so I was just a bit confused.
Sorry.
Also, you were kind of tapping on the podium at some points. Sorry. And sorry, and Sohit or Oscar said, maybe add more to your conclusion, so it's more going out with a bang instead of just kind of restating.
And then, they said, you said I argue, you coughed a lot, and then when you would pause, you at one point said, okay, sorry, and then did you write an actual speech or are you reading?
Yes, I actually wrote an actual speech, but I wasn't reading off it.
Okay.
Oh.
At certain points, it seemed like you were reading off bullet points because you would start to say something and then you would stop, you would look down, you would look up, say sorry, and then you would keep speaking. So it was almost like you didn't know what you were gonna say.
It sounded like you had practiced it and it was really good during practice, but you kind of lost your wording and kind of wigged yourself out a little, scared yourself.
We're not that scary.
I know, but it's just a stage performance.
Yeah. Tony, Greco.
you said it all.
Oh. Okay. Do you know who's next by chance?
By
Actually, I have no idea. Sorry.
Okay, we'll just ask.
So
in. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel like we're like American Idol.
Because I'm always like, hey, Oscar.
What?
Dude, I felt so bad.
Dude, Devin, you're like the new Rose King.
You were the
Stacey
new
Part
Stacey.
two.
Okay, I wrote down a lot for J1 because I was like really like paying close attention and like I don't know, I just noticed a bunch of stuff. So I
You
figured
got crackers so you're not hangry.
yeah, I figured
Okay.
I should say it.
No, don't close it. Oops.
No, don't start. You can stop now. Wouldn't most people say that the Europeans were smarter than the Chinese? However, when the Chinese and Europeans were exploring during the 14th century, one could not claim this to be true. This was not true in the case of Vasco da Gama and Zenki. While the Europeans and priests shared a symbiotic relationship that was beneficial in ensuring that the priests could expand their faith to the conquered population and the Europeans could expand their territory, the Chinese, on the other hand, were not driven by political or religious factors, nor were they driven by global domination. The sole purpose for the Chinese explorations was to find out about the local culture and to trade. Through trade, they were also able to form many alliances. In reality, the Europeans would subdue, enslave, and slaughter many of the locals. On the other hand, the Chinese, under Zenki, were able to form many alliances, and they also had a lot more respect for the local cultures. This proves that the Chinese were far more refined than their European counterparts. The Chinese were sophisticated in terms of their trade, like interactions with the locals, and their culture. They did not have this mindset that the Europeans had, which was that the locals were inferior. They also had highly advanced technology and navies. The Chinese were exploring the world primarily for establishing trade routes. One way that they did this was through a tribute system. The tribute system ensured that the foreign dignitaries would be submissive and loyal to the king. In the event that foreign dignitaries did not pay tribute to the king, China would eventually cut off trade with them. They also treated the foreigners far better than the European counterparts. The Europeans, on the other hand, were not there only to gain fame and prosperity. They were also there to seize the riches from the hands of the barbarians in the newly created states and kingdoms. One way that they did this was through the Roman Pontiff, which gave them the power to subdue and enslave any non-Christian or Muslim that they encountered on their explorations. They also misled the local population into believing that they were advocating for a more superior religion and culture than their own. The Chinese explorers were more respectful of the local cultures and treated the foreigners with gifts and kindness. The gifts were given to show the transforming power of imperial virtue. However, it should be noted, in a few instances, if the dignitaries did not show respect to the emperor, they would be subject to punishment. When the Chinese went to Calicut, they had very good diplomatic relations with the king, and they would start the negotiations off with giving the king robes and charters. This also had political benefit for King Zamarin, the king of Calicut. The tribute system was not at all barbaric. The Europeans, on the other hand, had two ulterior motives. The first was to find King John of the Indies, and the second was the forced conquer of many nations, whereby they would steal the riches from the locals. Another way that they would subdue and enslave the non-Christians and Muslims was they would chop off the hands, the feet, and the heads of the locals, and then they would burn the ships. In conclusion, the Chinese and European explorers have left their mark on their world. Their early explorations have resulted in an enormous exchange of goods and ideas across the seven seas. It needs to be recognized, while that the Europeans had multiple objectives for their travels, i.e., trade, expanding their empires, and propagating their religion. On the other hand, the Chinese were primarily interested in the trading of goods and an exchange of cultural influences.
There was some paper on the podium right there.
Before they critique you, can I just say I really like your earrings. Those are cute. Okay. Oscar.
Your pocket, you're fiddling with them and like making sounds, so it's kind of distracting. And you're also like, I didn't find your hook very hooky because you kind of just said like most people say that Europeans are smarter than the Chinese. I'm not sure smarter is the right word to use. Yeah, it's like you should maybe use like more civilized and maybe expand more on that hook. Those were interesting.
Your speech itself was somewhat monotone and it seemed kind of like you were reading off your paper. And your eye contact needs to be a little better because you're kind of staring into space.
Yeah, not only were you staring into space, but like probably it was the nerves where you looked at like all of us and like you seemed really scared. So if that like happens, maybe you could just like take a breather for like a few seconds and then continue. It could help you.
Yeah, I also noticed that, yeah, like Crystal said, like take a breather, take pauses, like you have time. What was the time?
4:22.
4:22. You have like a good like 40 seconds left. Just like you have time. You can, yeah. And I noticed that you also said for Jung He, you said Zheng He.
You're not the first.
You're not the
You're not the first one
It's good.
today to do.
That's like actually a lot of people, but just like watch out for that. Mr. Ross says jump her in class, so I'm assuming that's that. And you said like a couple times when you were explaining. It sounded a bit as if you were. It sounded like you were. It just sounded a bit casual. It sounded like you were explaining it to like a friend and not really giving a presentation at some points. And just a bit of at the beginning you said wouldn't someone say something question mark, however, and wouldn't and however, I don't think those like go together as like double, you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Does that make any sense? Like and another example of this where you said like while something on the other hand.
That's
So-
fine.
That's right.
While Devin likes to play sports.
On the other hand, isn't it like the same thing?
On the
Isn't it
other
like
hand,
either or?
mine doesn't.
I think it's either or of them. I'm
Either
pretty
way.
sure you only say one of them. If they both, I could be wrong, but it just sounded a bit odd, like kind of out of
It
context.
didn't.
Yeah, it didn't really like flow with them together, like with while and on the other hand.
I have two quick things to add. You said pompous within your speech.
Oh, pompous.
Yeah.
I thought I said pontiff.
Oh, pontiff. Sorry. I'm like,
I heard
just but either way, you want to be sure to define what those are so that your audience knows what it is. And then at the end in your conclusion, I believe it was, you said IE. Just don't say IE. I'm trying to think of a better word off the top of my head.
For example.
For example, yeah, just say that because it's a little bit more formal. That's all. Lonnie?
I just wanted to like connect to something that Oscar said about your hands in your pockets. I think you should just be a little bit more aware of what your hands are doing. Like I saw your hands were like moving with the rhythm of your voice. And like that helps you like talk, but I feel like gestures are supposed to be like significant, like
Well,
to
like,
emphasize big
You
words.
were doing the gestures, but we couldn't see them, so it looked awkward. But like, if you brought your hands up like above the podium, it would look natural, and it would actually be like really good. So like, your hand gestures aren't bad. It's just because like we can't see them.
And
Yeah?
when you finish a speech, like be sure to say like thank you so we know you're done. Because like when you just pause, you're like,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I did
Yeah.
say thank you.
I
I
mean,
stood there and I was just like, and he was like, you're supposed to say thank you. I was like, oh, thank you.
So yeah, it was really good though.
Good job. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Ricky.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Can you send to the next person, please?
Okay, you still can't say while and on the other hand together. That's so not a thing. You say like, for example, while
I literally
while
feel
Tommy,
I don't
like
know.
that's like saying while Ryan,
Luke.
while Ryan
Okay.
had like,
Okay, heads up.
Chris.
Chris. No.
I'll explain it later. You still can't say them together. That's not.
Yeah.
a thing.
No.
Our human history has been considered quite barbaric because of the continuous violence and wars that had happened between all of us. And although most of these wars consisted of many countries from various parts of the world, during the age of exploration of the Indian Ocean, around 600 years ago, the Chinese proved to be more civil than its western counterpart Europe by being more religiously tolerant, having different economic motives, and having a more ethnically diverse population. Firstly, the Chinese had a very high level of tolerance for other religions, as we can see on a Sri Lankan stone tablet where it praises the gods of Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Furthermore, the Chinese had many religions in their own country, such as Arabs, Confucianism, and Buddhism, and all of them were treated equally. They all coexisted pretty peacefully in between each other. None of them were discriminated. An example of this would be Zheng He, who was Muslim, but he was still chosen for the very important job instead of many other people of different religions. On the other hand, the Europeans, they were very intolerant towards other religions. The Pope allowed the Portuguese king to use violence against any non-Christians or Muslims when they encountered them in the Indian Ocean. So as a result, Vasco da Gama, he captured many Muslim ships around the Persian area. He stole most of their goods and even tortured a lot of them. Another reason why Christianity, the Christians were very keen on spreading their religion, and this caused a lot of violence because if someone did not want to convert, they would be forced, and that's where the violence would come. The second reason why the Chinese were more civil was because of their different economic motives. They were not keen on making more money, they already had enough money, but instead they wanted to enhance the name of the new Ming dynasty, so they would give gifts when they would arrive to create an alliance between the kings, and eventually the kings of that area would pay tribute to the emperor back in China. They made no territorial claims, which proved that conquest and discovery were not one of their motives. And even though they had a huge army of around 300 ships and over 30,000 men, they never used them to conquer or harm anyone, but merely to impress and defend themselves from pirates. The Europeans, they wanted a lot of profit from these expeditions. The king, before Vasco da Gama's start, he wished them good luck in finding many new resources that would benefit them later. And lastly, the Chinese had a very diverse demography in their own country. There were various ethnic groups such as the Arabs, the Mongols, the Han, and many more. And even though the Mongols were eventually pushed out, it was more of an act of self-defense and a tactical move for survival rather than aggression. Europe, on the other hand, they were mainly white. There were not many foreigners. Any foreigners that would come in the country through mostly Spain were pushed out during the Spanish Inquisition in the late 1400s. They were forced to leave, forced to convert, or even they were tortured to convert. And these reasons were why the Chinese were more civil and are considered still today more civil than the Europeans. They had a very high tolerance for other people. They were able to adapt to different people. They took advantage of the different resources that everyone had and were able to benefit not only themselves but others. Thank you.
A sincerest apology to you during your speech and that rudeness. I did not know that was on my phone. It's my sincerest apology.
Oscar?
Luke, I thought your content was really good, except you're a bit monotone at times. And also, what else? bit monotone.
You kind of spoke too quickly sometimes. And one of your sentences, you were listing things, so you said something and something and something, full stop, and. That was, you said that a few times throughout your speech, and you just ended it too.
Okay, you're shaking throughout the whole thing. Like right now you're bouncing. Okay.
It's not that you're like shaking, it's like that you're bouncing up and down. And it's like
you on your toes or something?
And in between sentences, sometimes you go and then you would say. So yeah.
Um, in your at the beginning of your speech during your hook, you said a lot of wars between all of, I think it was us or some like personal pronoun, just made it sound a little casual. And same, you kind of said vague words a lot, like very, like for example, like very. So maybe like try to find variations on those words.
I noticed you used keen a lot. I think you used it like 2 or 3 times in a matter of like 2 sentences, so it sounded a little repetitive. So I just changed that. Aside from that, you're good. Tony?
Nothing to say. Your structure was really good. Like, I could tell which different body paragraphs.
Okay, thank you.
And your recovery was great from then on. My apologies. Thank you very much. Who's next?
Is Chris the last one?
No, we have 2
there's
more.
still Karina.
No, Karina?
Who?
Min was just standing at the door
I
watching.
know.
Yeah, I literally
I-
shut them off.
I was like,
saw
Was that Chris or Lou?
No, we've
That's
done
Lou.
1,
That was
2,
Lou.
3, 4. We've done 5.
So we have Chris and Yasmin.
And Karina.
No,
Karina
no,
went
went
first.
first.
Oh right, yeah.
I don't know why, but
The Indian Ocean was the biggest trade center of its time, in which the Chinese and the Europeans both entered into during the 15th century, of course the Chinese coming a couple decades before the Europeans. However, this age of exploration proves and makes it painfully clear that China was more civilized than the Europeans. Looking at their religious and political interactions with the locals and the economic effects that they each left during and after their presence. First off, looking at the religious interactions, of course, China was more liberal than the Europeans were. China was more accepting of other religions as Confucians, and so much so that Zheng He treated each religion equally and offered 1,000 pieces of gold, 5,000 pieces of silver, multiple rolls of embroidered silk, gold vases, scented oil, and much more to each deity in the region, which included Muslims Allah, the Buddha of Buddhism, and multiple Hindu gods. On the other hand, the Europeans were highly religious. And I quote, "Even the most friendly Christian had to regard his religion absolutely true, and to regard non-Christians as unregenerate enemies or miserable souls in need of light." It is quite clear that the Europeans considered themselves to be superior to all around the world. And so in a letter, the Europeans offered these locals to change their religion, to convert to Christianity. And they claimed that in the case that the locals did not convert their religion, the Europeans stated that they would powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you, and take you and your wives and your children and make slaves of them. Of course, there were multiple threats in there, including pillage, rape, murder. And perhaps the Europeans thought they were blessing these locals with their superior religion. But it is quite clear that the offerings that Zheng He made was more civilized than the threats that the Europeans offered. Moving on to their political interactions, Emperor Yongle intended to boost China and his own reputation. He asked that each state leader pay tribute to him in return for prosperous trade in their state. Granted, the fleet of the Chinese was huge, but this fleet never used force in any situation unless they were provoked first or pirates attacked them. Moreover, China proceeded to make political alliances with state leaders, including the Zamorin of Calicut, who they promised that they would protect in case any relative intended to take his throne from him. But the Europeans intended to gain fame, praise, and take goods and riches from the states that they encountered on these voyages. Moreover, Da Gama faced multiple clashes with and fought the locals on multiple instances, one of them including the Zamorin of Calicut, who wanted to have Da Gama pay taxes for the goods he had brought to his land. And Da Gama, considering himself superior to the Zamorin's laws, was infuriated and proceeded to take hostages from Calicut, and multiple years later he returned for retribution and declared war on Calicut. And during this war, he pillaged Calicut, brutally murdered multiple people, and when the Zamorin sent a messenger to discuss peace, Da Gama proceeded to rip his lips and ears off of the messenger and replace his ears with dog ears. Obviously, China was more civilized and more controlled than the Europeans were in their political interactions. Lastly, looking at the economical effects that each left behind, China entered and left behind a prosperous trade center, being the Indian Ocean. They left no harm, and they only extended their knowledge and influence over their region. And perhaps the Chinese even influenced trade, enhanced trade in the region through their fixed prices on each good that went through the region. The Europeans, on the other hand, left Calicut in destruction, stole their goods, and definitely left the trade center in a worse state than the Chinese did. Furthermore, Da Gama had barely anything that he could offer to the kings that they met, the state leaders that they met. Even the Zamorin of Calicut claimed that Da Gama had goods that were not even worthy of the poorest merchant that came to his throne. Europe also monopolized the region, and Da Gama forced groups to go through them to trade, imposing high taxes, and ultimately destroyed trade in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, as a whole, looking at the religious ways with Zhonghe making offerings to each deity, and Da Gama claiming they were superior over them, in the political ways, the Chinese creating alliances, and the Europeans destroying them, and the economical effects with China enhancing trade, Europe ruining it, it was quite clear that China was more civilized than the Europeans. Thank you.
Wait, what was your counterclaim?
We did have granted the Chinese ships were
Chinese ships were huge. Europeans might have thought they were blessing them, but they were threatening them.
Oh, Roman, that was really good.
You guys, if you want to say something, you gotta make it quick because Yasmin's gonna go.
Yeah. We have
Okay, so Oscar go.
What did you do?
Oh, okay, so
nothing. Crystal.
At the beginning you were shifting sides about like you were leaning on one side and the other, and like at some parts you went really fast. Maybe just take a breather and slow down a little bit. It's probably just the nerves.
Yeah, like Crystal said, you were kind of talking really fast. There weren't many pauses, if any pauses. But I mean, it's kind of understandable since you like hit 5:06. So it's like a lot of information to cover. But maybe like try to reduce it down so you have time to take pauses. Also, at the very beginning, you said something about the Indian Ocean being some kind of like trade center, and then you said of its time. I was just a bit confused because the Indian Ocean still exists today. So
I said it was the biggest trade center of its time.
It's not a transition around the trade.
Oh, I thought you said something about like something. No, it just sounded kind of weird to me because of its time and like the Indian Ocean still exists today. It's just a bit confusing. Sorry. You had a lot of hand gestures, which can be good in moderation, but I found them a bit distracting sometimes. Like you would kind of have a lot of hand gestures where they weren't really necessary, and yeah. Also, you said furthermore and moreover a lot, so maybe try to like switch that up a little. And
You said the Zamorin of Calicut. You said it multiple times. However, you never defined what a Zamorin was. So to outsiders, like they don't know what that means. And then your conclusion was kind of just restating your thesis. There was nothing that really like impacted me and left me going like, oh my god, like about it. So I don't know.
I have nothing.
Alright.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for auditioning.
You're like.
Well, I
you
mean,
roast
if I
people
don't
in
say
space.
anything, then they can't
Okay.
improve for next time.
If the entire world's history was compiled into one giant textbook, the maritime voyages of the Ming Dynasty China would barely be a footnote. Although many historians consider these voyages to be ones of aggression, these expeditions were so much more than missions of conquest. Throughout the Age of Exploration, China showcased itself as a civilized culture through its advanced technologies and foreign interactions, technologies that the Europeans had not yet come to discover. At the beginning of the 15th century, China was the world's most important naval power. Zheng He's original fleet had more than 300 ships, a stark comparison to the 132 vessels of the Spanish Armada. The pride of the Chinese fleet were the massive treasure ships, made to hold large amounts of trade goods and treasure. They could hold up to 3,000 tons of goods, and boasted features such as 9 masts, 3 decks, and watertight compartments that, if flooded, could be used for laundry and fishing. Advancements the rest of the world, Europe included, had not yet even approached. The Chinese traded with local cultures and developed luxury goods such as silk and porcelain that they used to engage in trade. In stark contrast, the European offers of trade, if made, were minimal and quite poor, such that native rulers often turned down offers of trade. Despite there only being a 60 years gap between China and Europe arriving in the Indian Ocean, China had already developed advanced technologies that Europe had not yet seen. In spite of having an undeniably powerful navy, the Chinese were not aggressive in their interactions with foreign cultures. Rather than attempting to conquer locals, they traded with them for valuable items such as pepper, spices, and gold. The main goal of China's voyages were to help establish the legitimacy of Emperor Yongle and to create alliances and future trade options. Chinese encounters with locals rarely ever became violent, with the few exceptions only being when they were provoked or attacked. Zheng He would also invite foreign leaders to pay tributary missions to China in exchange for the privilege of being able to trade tax-free. China was also incredibly tolerant of other cultures and religions, often incorporating them into their own culture. A primary example being Zheng He himself. Zheng He, who was the leader of these voyages, was born a Muslim from the Mongol province of Yunnan. Despite his background not being Chinese, he was chosen to lead these voyages because of his expertise in Islam. The overall goal of the Chinese voyages were to open up trade routes and to receive tribute, which were very different from those of the Europeans. The Europeans, enraged by refusals of trade, would often resort to violence, using horrifying methods of torture and death. The Portuguese reportedly, at one point, cut off the ears, noses, and hands of locals they captured, and sent them back in shame. They even got to a point where they burned a pilgrimage ship on its way to Mecca. While the Europeans had embarked on these missions for conquest and conversion, with the result often being measured by a body count. It's quite possible that the European interactions contrasted the Chinese so severely because of their different religious values. Confucianism and its core principles of intelligence and humanity shaped China's values, which translated into their actions through the Age of Exploration. While on the other hand, Christianity-driven Portuguese were pushed to try and convert and conquer land. Whatever the reason, the 15th century voyages through the Indian Ocean proved that Confucian China was a far more civilized and value-oriented nation, something that has been translated into the modern society and can still be seen in the world today. Thank you. Okay, hold on.
Tell me, I'll let you
another thing is you were cracking your knuckles.
Was I? I was trying not to. Yeah.
Like I could see you fiddling with your hands, and then I heard like 3 cracks, and I was like, oh.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you said pace yourself, slow down, and don't crack your knuckles. Okay.
You gave some like weird pop like a dragon.
What?
You were like.
You were like, did I do that too?
You messed up and then you like. So maybe like if you mess up, just like keep it chill,
Just
like
don't.
take a breath
Okay.
Yeah,
instead of like
that was the
exhaling
only
with weird
thing.
noises.
That was such a Jasmine thing to do though.
Did I actually do that? I do that when I get nervous, and I'm like, do not do
You'll
that.
be able to watch the video. Just like when that happens, like if you get nervous, just kind of like take a breather.
Okay.
Also, at the beginning, you were kind of swaying a little.
Okay.
That's bad.
Brian.
I love you too.
I'm kidding. I love you.
He was just like swaying a little, and yeah, like he said, like pace yourself, take more pauses, maybe. I thought it was okay.
Okay.
Devin just said what I was saying.
Anything
The
else?
conclusion was kind of like restating. You didn't do much, really. You just kind of said good pieces again.
Okay.
There's no.
Yeah, I agree with Stowe. Like with the conclusion, you're supposed to like leave the reader thinking, and you didn't really do that with your conclusion. But the rest of your body paragraphs were really good.
Okay. Anything else? Or
Can you ask Sarah to come in here so she can do the computer?
yeah, I'll go
quick?
grab her.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much. Appreciate it. Very good.
You can
Thank
tell
you.
them all to come in.
Sure.
We need to make sure. Yeah. It's still taping, so let's wait till Sarah comes. Stacy, I call Sarah. Sorry. Stacy.
Man, I could see your
Man,
little
you're just like,
head.
yeah.
Oh my God.
Okay, guys, wait up. We're still taping. Let's wait for Stacy. Come on, Stacy. It's all you. Sorry to get so quick to the end of the class.
I like you.